Hello, and welcome to the Sidekick Stories podcast, encouraging conversations about mental health. Today I'm speaking to Hakeem Allen. Hakeem is the founder of the Anti-Racist Social Club that works to create spaces and resources for education and open dialogue with white people and non-Black people of colour about becoming anti-racist. They also host corporate workshops for building anti-racist organisations, equipping senior leadership with diversity and inclusion best practices, improving recruitment and retention, and reshaping corporate culture to be more inclusive of marginalised groups. Hakeem, hello.
Hello.
How are you?
Thanks for having me. I'm good, and I'm actually meaning that when I say that. I think oftentimes people will just say, "Oh, I'm fine," when they're really not. And had you asked me over the weekend, I would have said I was feeling very run down and like exhausted. And it was actually really important for me to realize that and take some time to just kind of de-stress. And so I ended up going to an amusement park with my best friend earlier in the week.
Lots of fast rides.
Yeah, and no lines because it was just not the best weather, but it was good enough. And so yeah, it's like pizza, it's always just good enough, even if it's not super great.
And always needed, let's be honest.
Always needed. So yeah, I feel refreshed and I feel excited. And I think oftentimes when I'm thinking about my own state of mental health and my own being now, I often compare it to myself maybe 5 or 10 years ago. And I definitely would not have been able to recognize the things that I can recognize now. And I'm definitely more proactive about it. So yeah, I'm doing well.
Awesome. So, yeah, I'm very well. So actually that's it. I think you framed it so nicely, like that journey that you've gone through from maybe yourself 10, 15 years ago. Like the goal of this is what we want to do is to have an honest and open conversation about your mental health journey and to get some insight into the tools and techniques that have helped you and are available and accessible to other people. And by discussing your journey, we hope to share and normalize the conversations about mental health, as often people are not alone in these experiences. And what we talked earlier just before was that, what you're going to be talking about is around identity, your identity, people's identity, and identity in general, which I think is a fascinating topic. So over to you.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, thinking about what to talk about, mental health is such a big concept, right? I mean, we have everything from meditation and yoga and breath work to just simply being mindful and aware of what's happening. And so I think for me, when I think about mental health, I think about how it's kind of changed over my life in relation to my identity. So I identify for all intents and purposes as a gay Black male. And as you can tell from my shitty accent, I'm from the indigenous lands of the Native Americans, also known as the US of A. So I grew up in a very military suburban town. And so as a gay Black kid, you can imagine my life was pretty easy. Exactly. So for me, when I think about my mental health journey, it really starts back in those early days of school. So I can still remember the first bully I ever had. I'm not going to say his name, but I can still remember the thing that he would say to me. And I haven't thought about this in a while, but I was 6 or 7 years old and I'm 27 years old now. So 2 decades later, and I can still remember his face and what he said and where we were in the school. It's crazy, right? 2 decades later, but that is part of mental health, right? Things stick with us. And sometimes emotional scars can run deeper and often do than physical scars because it's something that doesn't always heal on your own like the physical body can. And so before you have any vocabulary or language around mental health, you're just dealing with it on your own. And especially as a kid, you don't really know what mental health is. You don't have an understanding of, okay, if you talk about these things, this will be better for you. So for me, it goes back to probably 10 to 13 years of bullying for me, which I think really set me up for the work I had to do later on with my mental health. So just from every aspect of identity, whether it was because I was one of the few Black kids in one of our classes. So at most there was 2. If there was 3, the quota was off and some other class was missing. And being a gay kid, in a conservative military town, that's just not something that, first of all, you talk about, but second of all, that you have an opportunity to talk about it with other people. And so there's not other people that really look or feel like you.
Yeah.
And it's funny now because I'll see people all the time from high school and uni who like come out later on in life. And I just think to myself, like, God damn it. Like, couldn't you just do that like when we were in the same spaces? Yeah. But I think as a kid, dealing with those just forces within you is almost cognitive dissonance, all right? Like you're trying to, first of all, just exist in this world, which throws a lot at you as a young person.
Yeah.
But then also you're dealing with a racial identity that is marginalized institutionally across the board, whether it's education, healthcare, work, etc. And then you're dealing with an unseen identity, which can be equally as damaging, you know, historically not as much as, you know, the Black population, but no one aspect of my identity is greater on the whole. Maybe in a given day, I might be experiencing more homophobia than racism, but
yeah.
As a kid going through puberty, trying to quote unquote become a man and learn what that means as a Black man in America, but then also what does it mean to be somebody who maybe likes the same gender? It's a lot of confusion. Throw in an element of religion and spirituality because that was something, and it still is part of my life. You have all these forces just working not often in tandem with each other. And so when you don't necessarily have people to talk to, I didn't have resources. I didn't feel comfortable talking to it about family, and I didn't have friends to talk to about it because I was bullied so much and I was on my own. So I can honestly say that I don't necessarily like the phrasing suicidal, but there were definitely days, especially around 8th grade. So we're talking 12 or 13 years old, where I would go to bed just thinking, I don't want to wake up tomorrow if it's going to be the same like today. So there was never, you know, I'm worked as a resident advisor in university. I've taken first aid and mental health courses. So, you know, when it comes to suicide, knowing the actual, you know, steps that you look for, is there intent, etc. None of that existed for me. There were no means that were thought about. It was just that feeling of going to bed every night where I experienced something thinking, is this what life is? Yeah. And if it is, I just don't want to do it again tomorrow.
And that must have been incredibly difficult. And I think your analogy earlier about the difference between the physical body and the mental side as well, like 12, 13, puberty, hormones are racing, your mind is forming, and it's forming into those connections which will, once we hit 18, 19, 20, are going to form the basis of our subconscious biases, et cetera, and the way we look and perceive about the world. Like going through what you did, and from every single angle, may that be, like you said, from bullying, may that be from loneliness, may that be from, from identifying with your sexuality, understanding how, as a Black person within a majority white situation, how that would, how that would come to pass. And frankly, do you think that your brain had a chance to thrive? To because that's so much going on, and and so much to unpick later on at the same time.
Yeah. So all of that, and then let's just for fun sprinkle on a little bit of depression and anxiety. Yeah. So like I again didn't have that vocabulary until I got to university or even the end of high school to be able to start recognizing those things. But I did suffer from anxiety, and I still do, and depression early on. But again, not knowing what that looked like or who to talk to about it.
Yeah.
For me, think of it just like a balloon. And I kept everything inside, and it just kept expanding and expanding. And because I didn't know how to manage relationships, because I didn't have many friends, I got to a point where the only way for me to cope was to cut people out of my life. Yeah. So if somebody did something to me, somebody bullied me, I would delete them out of my phone, delete them off Facebook, whatever social media we had at the time. It's so weird to think back to what we did and didn't have.
Yeah.
But I almost said Instagram. I was like, wait, no, that didn't happen. But I was deleting them from everything because it was the only way that I could suppress the negative emotions. So you do that for so many years, and you're not developing long-term relationships with family or friends.
Yeah.
And you're bottling everything in, and often it will get to a point where you just can't hold it in anymore. And
Yeah.
so for me, I sometimes look back and I wonder, like, how am I still alive? Like, how did I survive that? I think spirituality plays a role in that for me, and that is, you know, core to my beliefs. But even early on, I mean, trying to figure out a religion and your sexuality at the same time, when often those forces are opposed to each other, like, I mean, don't even get me started about like what that venture looked like, because it was like, well, I want to be a part of this organization, but they don't seem to want me, and no one else looks like me either. So what am I doing? Like, where do I belong? I never felt like I belonged anywhere, because if we're being honest, and right, that's what we're here to do. There is a level of homophobia in the Black community, and there's a level of racism in the LGBTQ communities. So it's like wherever I existed, I never really felt like I had a place. And so for most of my life, it was just me. And so it really took time for me to start being able to learn how to have relationships with people and how to communicate with people. And for me, on this kind of mental health journey, I think one day that I will never forget that changed my life was a day that Challenge Day happened. So there used to be this TV show on MTV called If You Really Knew Me. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of it, but have you heard of it?
I have, yes.
Okay, yeah. So
I literally just flashed back to my days sat on the couch watching MTV and MTV Cribs as well.
Oh my gosh, throwback. So yeah, for anyone who's listening who's not familiar, basically these kind of inclusion leaders would come into like high schools, and they would talk about what diversity and inclusion looks like. And you know, they had an activity called If You Really Knew Me, and it was an opportunity for people to grab the mic and say something to their peers that they didn't feel comfortable saying before. So it was a lot around bullying and just trying to promote inclusion. And so for me, I watched that show, and there were so many times where I would see episodes that I would think, oh my God, I wish that would happen at my school. And then it did. And so they weren't one of the films. So if you can imagine, this company is doing these workshops, I mean, throughout the US, and not all of them are getting filmed. So they came to my school, and I can still remember the leader's name, Dawn. I still have her name tag, because that's how sentimental the experience was for me. I still remember just breaking down crying during the activity of If You Really Knew Me. And somehow I powered through all the fear, and I got up in front of everyone and basically said, for the first time, I think it was, I sometimes mix up the dates. I'm pretty sure that I was 17. We'll go with that. But for the first time, I stood up in front of everyone and I said, I am so lonely and I have no friends. And if you really knew me, you know that it's sometimes unbearable to get through the day. And it was such a
that must be so hard to say that.
It was such a release. And like at such a young age to be able to do that, I do have to think back and give myself props for that, because
hell yes.
I mean, in that moment, I was so terrified, but it was the first time that I said, I don't feel like I belong anywhere. I don't feel like I have any friends. I don't feel loved. And that, I think, was the starting point for me, because, you know, things didn't just end, right? Like things didn't just like automatically become easier, but then I started to be able to have a conversation around what those feelings looked like. And then leading into university, it gave me a platform to then be able to seek out the professional help I needed. And so I went to a university that offered a program for free therapy. It was graduate students who were needing hours to get practicum, and so they would have, you know, cameras to monitor them, etc. And for me, it was like, well, yeah, I come from a low-income background. I worked umpteen jobs during university, so like I didn't have the opportunity to pay for professional care. And so when I had that opportunity, I took it. And I'm so glad I did, but I'm constantly thinking about, especially now in the work I do around anti-racism and diversity, the racial disparities of access to mental health are just astronomical. And had it not been for that program, we would be having a very different conversation right now. I don't even know if I would have found your resource, because had I not had that therapy intervention, I would not be the same person I am now.
And but at the same time, it's amazing. Like age 17, when you were able to stand up and say that, like that takes a lot of guts, and it's a huge amount of bravery. Like in some respects, do you think that bravery was always there?
It's an interesting question because it often reminds me of the question or the comment people will say when you talk about your past when it comes to like bullying and things like that or emotional trauma. It comes from a good place, but people will often say, oh, well, it made you stronger. And I actually, sometimes I push back on that because I don't think it made me stronger. I think it made me weaker. And I think doing the work afterwards is what made me stronger. And so was the bravery there? Well, you could argue yes, but not in the context of mental health and emotional stability. The bravery was there. I was a public speaker and I did debate team. And so I was at the age of 16 speaking in front of over 1,000, over 1,500 people. Like that level of bravery and courage was there. But I didn't have anyone to talk to about anything, about the bullying at school, about my sexuality, about how I was feeling in terms of my race. I mean, I still remember after track practice one day in middle school, two guys picked me up and threw me in the shower with all my clothes on. It was called showering and everyone laughed. And those are images I still have in my head occasionally. Whenever I hear the name of one of those bullies, I automatically think of that moment. So for anyone who thinks of this idea as, well, the things in your childhood make you stronger, I just think you actually have to critically think about what you're saying, because in a way you're almost rationalizing the negative experience of someone, as opposed to just saying like, fuck, that was shit. I'm really sorry you dealt with that, and being okay with saying, I don't know how that might have been for you, but I'm glad, you're opening up with me about it now. But yeah, I definitely think looking back, I would be doing myself a disservice if I would say that like, oh yeah, I was the bravest kid around, that I knew what I was doing at the time. It definitely wasn't the case. It's just now I have the vocabulary to talk about these things.
And it sounds like at the time, if I can in any way, I can't empathize, but sympathize and try and put myself in your shoes, probably a combination of anger, desperation, someone saying to you that the company there going, does anyone have anything to say, giving you a voice or giving you the opportunity to speak and saying, actually, I'm fit to burst. That balloon is too big now.
Like it wasn't anger. I would say it was probably more of that, like, I don't know what else to do, that level of desperation. And it wasn't anything that I had formulated. Like I never, even watching the TV show, I never thought to myself, oh, if they came to my school, this is what I would say. It was just something where I knew like that would be such a great opportunity. And then it happened. And even when I knew it was coming to my school and I was participating, I kept thinking to myself, well, this activity is coming and you're not going to say anything, right? And like, that was probably just my anxiety, who I've affectionately named Kyle. We, in my self-help book club called Shelf Help, we're reading a book, and also my therapist kind of backed this up as well in a previous session around the idea of naming your fears and your insecurities or the challenges you face, because then you're able to like talk yourself out of some of those behaviors. And so the first thing that came to mind was this kid I used to hate in Boy Scouts, another one of my bullies. But it felt good to name my anxiety. And now I can look back and say, oh, that was just Kyle, like fucking me about or like trying to screw over my life.
Actually, to be honest, I think you put it very articulately. Like, it seemed from what I understand, from what I've read, there are many voices that go on in your head, and those voices are underpinned by different experiences, different emotions. And actually, it's very helpful to say, "Hold on, you shut up." Just shut up. I don't know what it is. I know I'm tired. I haven't. I drank too much last night, but I don't want you to talk now.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Sorry if you have to bleep all this stuff out, but one of my affirmations.
Go for it.
Mirror, fair. So I have affirmations on my mirror that I read to myself while I brush my teeth when I'm good. And I always brush my teeth, but when I'm good about my affirmations. And they range from anything to, I'm an heir of the Most High, I am black and beautiful. But I changed I am mentally resilient to Kyle can get fucked, because it felt more just relaxed and and entertaining for
but
me.
it's also what you probably think and how you say. In your head, it's just like, Kyle, fuck off. You're not welcome here at the moment.
Yes. But seriously, it's something I can laugh about now, but I can tell you every day of my life, I'm thinking about things in the context of Kyle, right? Like my anxiety, and I think one of the things I'm working on now is, so I'm a writer, and I'm working on a TV show around anxiety. It's going to be a psychological thriller, and I'm really excited about it. And one of the things I want to do with it is just bring the conversation around anxiety and even depression away from this idea that, oh, it's something everyone experiences. Like, yes, everyone experiences anxiety, but not everyone has an anxiety disorder. And there's a difference, because anxiety is not just worrying, right? Depression is not just sadness. I mean, you know all this. And so I think it's, again, it comes from a good place when people want to enter in that conversation with you and they'll say, oh yeah, I have anxiety too. But it's like, some people don't understand like what it actually means. I mean, it can be debilitating. It can actually prevent you from making decisions. It can affect you at work. It can affect you with your friendships and relationships. So, you know, for me, when I think about anything I do, I'm constantly having to battle this other voice in my head that's constantly trying to keep me safe in a way, but it sees everything as a threat. So you often hear, obviously, you know, fight or flight or freeze. And anxiety is, you know, a natural ability or way for your body to prepare yourself for, you know, the fears and the problems in life. And so, you know, often it's described as, you know, you see a lion, what are you going to do? But the thing with my anxiety and with a lot of people's is that everything in my life is a lion. So, you know, when it's a or B decision for something that's inconsequential, my brain sees it as, oh no, this is a lion coming to attack you. And so my body then has physiological responses as if I was being attacked by something. And so constantly having to battle that and then do that before I had the vocabulary to understand that, when I was still going through therapy in uni or even before that in school, I seriously don't know how sometimes I am here now, because like, what do you do with all of that as a kid? It's hard. And I never want this to come across as condoning suicide or anything like that, because it's not. But I 100% fully understand why someone would take their own life. I've been in that place. Fortunately, there was something either looking out for me spiritually or someone looking out for me physically. I don't know what it was. And I'm so happy that I'm here to be able to talk about my story. But I completely understand why somebody just would find it unbearable to go on, because mental health, especially for men, which is something really important for me, improving male access to mental health, is just not talked about enough. And so, like, I just want, and this is why I was so excited to have this conversation, people to be more vulnerable, right? Whether it's talking about mental health or even when it's talking about the work I do with anti-racism education and the podcast that we're working on, which is around normalizing making mistakes and admitting to them and being okay with that and learning. We have to normalize being vulnerable, because we all have the ability to be vulnerable. We just choose to mask it or subconsciously mask it without, you know, our own understanding. But we have to start talking more about these things, because that's when we realize that, as cliche as it sounds, we're all more similar than we are different, and that more connects us than divides us. For the most part, there are some people who are very far right that I don't think there's a lot that connects us.
I would fully agree with that.
Okay.
It's interesting what you're saying, like about normalizing these conversations. It's why we're having this chat now. And sometimes being vulnerable actually is probably being more of yourself. Like, I've certainly found that when you are in the traditional, I'm reading this great book at the moment called The Descent of Man by Grayson Perry, which is around the descent of masculinity and basically all the problems of masculinity. And that masculinity puts on, you have shells of yourself. And part of that is not to be vulnerable, not to talk about emotion, not to talk about feelings, particularly in, in Britain. From my own perspective, I think Brits are known as people who are pretty stiff upper lip and don't really talk about things, frankly.
Tell me about it.
Yeah.
Dating British men has been so fun for somebody who really needs emotional availability.
I feel like talking to brick walls. But in that situation, actually peeling away those layers and being vulnerable, I found at the same time you're actually more yourself, and you feel more that you're communicating in a way that actually connects with what your thoughts are, not what you think people are perceiving you as or anything external. There's a much easier flow from your internal through to your external without any modification in between. And I find that empowering.
Yeah. 100%. I think so. Something we talk a lot about in kind of anti-racism education is this idea of code switching, and how even subconsciously marginalized communities are often trained just by culture and society around them to act a certain way in front of certain people. So you might have heard about this movie called Sorry to Bother You, which is about this like black telemarketer who learns that he can get more sales by putting on a white voice. And so it's a comedic take, obviously, on a serious topic, but code switching is very real. I mean, as somebody who's worked in white-dominated professional environments, as a gay black male, and I should say white heterosexual dominated environments, as a gay black male, I'm constantly changing how I'm acting in front of other people. And it's not conscious. And it's not something where I'm purposely putting on a mask. It's just, you learn as a member of a marginalized group how to survive and how to thrive in environments that aren't designed for you. And so having to wear your hair a certain way or having to dress a certain way to fit in can be really taxing on your mental health. And it's something we talk a lot about when we talk about microaggressions and how they have emotional and physical, like research shows microaggressions have physical impacts on health, like the little things you can say that are filled with bias or subtly exclude people. All of these things that are just floating in the ether, they all affect mental health, right? And so it's so important that, especially in the work that I do, I'm always saying that anti-racism is inextricably linked to mental health. And I know that firsthand because my mental health has been impacted so much by my identity, the various aspects of my identity, right? And when I talk about identity, everyone has an identity, everyone has an element of diversity, right? So even if you're a white heterosexual male, don't let anything I ever say make you think that you aren't unique or valid, right? But you also have to accept the realities of the world, that a lot of the institutionalized structures of the world are designed to benefit you. And so for me, I'm always trying to get people to talk about mental health beyond just the conversation around, yoga and meditation. Those are great applications of improving mental health, but we really need to talk about what is our own role in other people's mental health, right? Like it's not to say that everyone needs to be responsible for everyone around them, but what are we doing that could be impacting someone's mental health? Right? Like, can you imagine that the bullies or the people who mistreated me were listening to this now and realize that there are points in my life where their actions would have caused me to make a decision? Like, I'm not going to put blame on anyone. The decision's with me, but often there is a level of blame that goes around. And so I think it's such an important conversation talking about being able to be vulnerable, because yes, it is being more of yourself, but it's also allowing you to just exist and bring your full self to an environment. And so one of the things that I loved when I was a resident advisor, living with the first years and being able to be a mentor, was that in the beginning, we were able to kind of shape our own kind of activities with them. So learning this from the challenge day activities that I went through, we had this activity called the Man Box, which I'm sure you've heard of. I mean, it's so tried and true. For women, obviously, it's the lady flower, but you draw this box and then you get participants to just throw things in the box. What can you and can you not do? So, men can't cry, that goes in the box. Men have to be strong, that goes in the box. And after we did all that, then I ripped this huge Post-it note and I said, fuck the Man Box. You guys are allowed to exist freely and however you want, and I'm here to support you. And that actually became the name of our group chat for the entire year, fuck the Man Box. And it was great because from an early point in the year, I was letting people know, look, this is university. This is your time to be who you are. And I want you to know that you are with somebody who knows that and who is here to support you. And so, yeah, I'm always trying to get people to get beneath the surface. And people don't often like it, like, especially with like dating. I talked about that before, but like one of my favorite questions to ask somebody early on is, how do you rank these elements of a relationship? So physical, sexual, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And I often find that people will say like, oh, that's a really deep question early on. But I'm a very emotionally deep person. And I think that level of vulnerability is not something that, especially men, but people are used to having early on. Whereas I'm the opposite. Like I went from not being able to talk about anything to now I'm so vulnerable that some people would say you need to hold your cards closer to your chest. But for me, when I learn something about somebody that's beneath the surface or that they don't talk about often, I feel like more connected to them, right? It's more endearing. And so I think vulnerability has more benefits than it has, you know, negatives. And I just don't think we're framed to think of it in that way.
And how, going back to the challenge day as well, when you were incredibly vulnerable, like a question that popped into my mind was, how did your peers react? And did it change?
So that's a great question. So I got hugs, right? I got people saying like, oh, they had no idea. But as I mentioned, like the emotional trauma didn't just stop.
No.
Right? Like, yes, people were aware of it. And this also was like in March of that year. So the school year ends in like June. And like, it was good that people were made aware of it. And it was more for me. It's almost like forgiveness, right? It's like more for you than the other person.
Yeah.
So it was more for me to get it off my chest. And at the time, I'm trying to think, like, most of the reaction was from other students of mine who then treated me a little bit nicer, but it was more of like being, you know, pity nice, which was fine. Like I at that point in my life, I would have taken pity nice over nothing.
Yeah.
But I don't actually remember like teachers coming back or reaching out and saying like,
that's
here's some resources. And I think,
really,
but I don't think that's unique to my school because so at the beginning of the summer, before I started the Anti-Racist Social Club and before I started writing a sitcom, I was actually doing mental health research. And I interviewed about 22 men over the course of 2 weeks, just around their mental health and what limits them in their engagement and where on their journey they feel like intervention would have been really helpful. And I talked to people as young as 10 years old. I used to babysit a lot, so I had access to like a younger talent pool, or not talent pool, but you know what I mean, research pool. And I talked to people older as well, but specifically in the conversations I had with a 10-year-old and a 16-year-old, I asked them around what is the vocabulary and what are the activities in your schooling system that relate to mental health. It's touched on in the surface, but it's still not where it needs to be. And so I can still remember after this challenge day thinking, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life, like doing these kinds of workshops. And it's funny now because I'm kind of doing that tangentially with the anti-racism work, because anti-racism is intersectional. So it's about diversity and inclusion across the board. And so there's an element of mental health and bullying that gets touched on. And I would love to do this work more in schools, but it's needed because I don't think that, and we can't expect teachers to be equipped with this knowledge. This is not a knock at all on the public education system. I am so fortunate for public education, and I think it needs more funding. I don't understand why celebrities and athletes get paid more than the people who are actually changing the world. And that goes for the NHS, for teachers, etc. But politics aside, I think that like teachers just aren't equipped with the resources they need, right? Like we're expecting them to be mothers or fathers, counselors, educators. It's a lot, right? And so I think there needs to be more education for teachers, but also for students, more activities, more curriculum. I mean, mental health should be as important than learning trigonometry, right? Like, I mean, let's be honest, how many people are actually going to need calculus? Now, I'm saying that as somebody who loved calculus and did really well at it, but I don't need it at all in my line of work now. But I really needed things that could have saved my life, like mental health. So we need to focus on, yes, you know, the history and English and the sciences, especially the sciences, especially the sciences these days. But
a silent nod to the sciences for me.
I like that. But mental health needs to be a part of that, right? Like we all have physical education and we all learn how to play dodgeball, but why didn't we also have meditation or stretching and yoga? Or why didn't we have conversations about mental health early on? And I think those would have been the things that would have helped me earlier. And so, I think the response from that challenge day was more of a level of pity and understanding or sympathy, but it wasn't enough for me to feel like, okay, cool, this problem's been solved. Like I really needed that professional support.
And going back to that analogy, that, you know, the difference between the physical body and your mind and your mental is that, you know, if you scrape yourself, it will heal back to what it was. If you break something, it'll be reset into back what it was. But if you have stuff going on in your head, that doesn't reset to what it was. It changes, and you think and perceive things in a different way as a consequence. So effectively, like how I visualize the brain is frankly a lot of scars, and your way that you perceive and you think, the way that you interact with people is not as a fresh brain. It is at a fully scarred brain. It's almost as if every kind of bad moment of bullying that you've had led to, you know, your finger being broken and reset in the wrong way. So it's frankly, it's not as useful as it could be.
Well, that's exactly what I'm talking about when I respond to people who are saying, oh, all of this made you stronger. Because to your point, it's like, you just can't see how weak it's made me. But I think it's here in the UK as well, but especially in the States, there's this joke that, you know, no matter what the injury, you just go to the nurse's office and she'll give you an ice pack. Concussion, you're bleeding, no matter what it is, just go to the nurse. But what's the equivalent of going to the nurse for an ice pack when it comes to mental and emotional damage, right? It's someone's bullied you, and there's often this narrative that, well, you know, either stand up to your bullies, which that is a whole conversation for another day around what are we telling like kids, like they need to stand up, yes, but what are the repercussions of that? Like sometimes it gets worse, but then also people don't always know how to stand up. So when we're talking about like mental health and especially bullying, the narrative is often like, oh, well, telling somebody's going to make it worse, which it often does. And so then what do you do with it, right? Like if you can't tell your teacher, or you tell your teacher and you're afraid that they're going to then tell the other person or how this works, like this is a lot for kids to process. And so I think early intervention in mental health is so important, especially when it comes to identity, because, you know, I often try to think, was my mental health and especially my depression and anxiety a result of my issues with identity, or was it the opposite way around? And I lean more towards the former, like my issues or challenges with, you know, coming to terms with my sexuality and coming to terms with my race in an all-white environment, those caused or contributed to my anxiety and depression for sure. But it also is a reciprocal relationship, right? Because then the anxiety then just perpetuates all these things that you're thinking or seeing and perceiving. And the mind is a tricky place. I mean, like we don't even realize subconsciously how much our brain does. Like we're just starting to understand the full. I think I saw something, maybe we understand 40% of what the brain can do. I'm not, don't quote me on that, but we are eons away from understanding fully what this thing in our skull can do. And part of that, yes, is holding on to emotional scars. Part of that is resilience as well, but part of that is also like coping mechanisms, right? And that is where I had to start unlearning those at an older age, like cutting people out of my life completely. At the time, that was a Band-Aid to a much bigger problem. That was like putting a Band-Aid on a dam, trying to prevent water from going through a crack. And at the time, it got me across the finish line and able to survive literally. But like, there is a lot more work that I'm still constantly doing. And that's another thing, is mental health as a journey. So it is still something that I'm constantly working on, but there is so much that we have to learn and help people understand about our mind, because our mind does a lot of coping and it thinks it's helping us, but in actuality, it's not. And we have to be aware of it and try to intervene.
And in going back to your talk about understanding the brain, how it works, like the more research that comes out is in the fact that what we perceive is represented in our brain. So it's not a direct correlation necessarily between what is actually outside of our body. So effectively, everything happens in the brain. And I find that when people talk about mental health, and it's a kind of a small section of your life. It's actually, for me, it is your entire life.
Yeah.
It's everything. And like you said, there's a massive reciprocity, if that's even a word, between.
Yeah, reciprocity is good.
Yeah, it's going back and forward. For example, for you were going back and forward in some respect around identity, but then in another respect, it would have been around your articulation, your vocabulary. And I can't remember which philosopher said it, but there's something that's always touched me or touched on me, is this phrase that language is skin. I think this is a really interesting way to look at it when you're talking around prejudice as well. Is that, and for you, it's very clear that you are extremely articulate and you have developed a vocabulary for you to articulate and appreciate and to communicate what those complex things that are going on with, inside of you. Now, take that to a 12, 13-year-old, then like you said, what can teachers do? Well, teachers might be able to, yes, they might not be able to deal with difficult mental health disorders or mental ill health, but what they can do is start having these conversations and enabling people to start to articulate what they are feeling. Because frankly, like you said, standing up to a bully, yeah, it has huge, it has lots of, often adverse side effects, but if you have a conversation with someone and say, look, like whatever's going on, please can we just have a talk? If you are able to have that back and forth and are able to articulate and suspend judgment of what that other person is saying in terms of their beliefs, in terms of their assumptions, just get them to listen to what you have to say. And if you can articulate that and you can listen back, my God, that could be a great healer.
I mean, language is so important.
Yeah.
So important. And again, I'm not going to get into the argument of, do people cause other people to commit suicide, or is it on them? You have the examples of like, there was a gay student who was, filmed engaging in perfectly normal behavior and ended up committing suicide because of the scorn and the retribution that got. And, people get on both sides of the argument and say, oh, well, it was his decision. And then some people say, well, you can get so overwhelmed you can't manage it. But I think that language does have to be something that we can't take it for granted. We have to understand that our words have power, and we hear it so often. But like, as you were saying that, I was thinking like, would my life be different if I had this vocabulary that I have now and I was able to talk to my bullies back then? Like after that incident of being thrown in the shower, if I was able to actually stand up and say like, hey, I just want you to know, like, this makes me feel like shit, and like, these are the kinds of things that lead people to taking their own lives. Like, what would that, like, are we able to process that as even the receiving end of that? Would a bully be able to like think through that? Because oftentimes they're just projecting their own shit.
Absolutely.
But also, like, is it appropriate, or is it reasonable, is a better word, for us to expect somebody so young to have something that I didn't gain until, 2 decades after the start of my education? I mean, a lot of my mental health journey has been through travel. I've been very fortunate to be able to travel around the world. And as a result of old jobs, or after Trump, that's all I'll say. 2016 was just a fucked year. Here in the UK as well with Brexit. I was working a block and a half from the White House, and I couldn't deal with it. I needed to get out. And that was my mental health journey, another episode in the journey. And for me, I packed up everything and I just left, and I started traveling, and I took a little sabbatical and ended up in Australia because it was the farthest place away that I could think of. And when I look back on that time, that year and a half, that was so crucial to my own understanding of self and my own levels of self-esteem. And that wasn't something that I think could have come through therapy on its own. I think just having to exist in the world and to be able to take what I learned through therapy, but then apply it in my everyday life, whether I was an au pair or whether I was bartending on a beach bar or whether I was acting or doing stand-up comedy, like I was just doing everything and anything that I ever wanted to do. And I felt so free. And being in that space of being vulnerable and free allowed me to love myself more than I ever have. And when I think about myself now, I mean, when I read my morning affirmations and I read, I'm Black and beautiful, I actually believe it. I actually believe those words. And that's not something that I would have believed in middle school and high school or even at university. And it took me years to get to that point where I actually could look at my body and say, damn, I'm fine. Like anyone would be lucky to date me.
Yeah.
That wouldn't have happened at a younger age. And I don't know how much education would have even gotten me to that point. So I think it's a mix of earlier intervention and also experience that comes later on in life. But it's not like one is more important than the other. I mean, if I had to choose one, I would say earlier intervention is so key to change things before they start, because really at the end of the day, the experience was helping me get to a point where I should have been early on, right? Like we should be growing up thinking that we're beautiful and confident and intelligent and being able to vouch for ourselves and not be in this space of insecurity and fear and etc.
That journey of learning often comes through those negative experiences at the same time as well. Like I always imagine, I say, like, what would I say to my 12-year-old, 13-year-old self? And actually, would I have changed any of the situations or struggles that I had perceived? And
definitely would have. I definitely would not have been taking on the bullying.
Absolutely.
Or the homophobia.
No, absolutely. But I completely agree. But at the same time, you can't give people the tools at 12-year-old and say, look, you've got everything you need.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Like everything in life, I've started to reframe, how sometimes you'll say like, oh, I'll take the L, right? For the loss. Well, like reframing that as L for lesson, that just changes so much, right? Like any negative experience should just be a lesson for you. But I don't want that to take away from the damage that those negative experiences can have. And so I think, it goes back to the idea of like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Like I'm 27 years old and I have a better sense of self than I've ever had. I love my body and I love who I am. I started to realize that my body is my friend. I mean, it's literally carrying me through a pandemic. And so I need to like treat it well. Yeah. And I have a better sense of relationships, a better sense of network. That came from just having stability, being in one place, but also being in an environment for the most part, which is a little bit more conducive to vulnerability and just openness, being in a more liberal city. It's not without its problems. I've had terrible experiences, but I think, yes, like the experiences that I've had, you can't change them. So there's no point even thinking about it in the sense that they are what brought me to the point of where I am now, right? Like, could I go back and think of any benefits from one of the experiences that were quote unquote negative? Maybe, but would that serve me now?
No.
Right? Like equally, it doesn't serve me to wallow in those experiences, right? Like it took me a while to be able to separate forgiveness from the idea of saying it's okay.
Yeah.
Like validating the experiences. Like those experiences were shit.
Yeah.
No one should ever have to deal with bullying or homophobia or racism. I grew up and I struggled. And I'm able to say that now and not feel like I'm playing the victim card or the race card or the gay card like people have told me, right? That from a while was me having to realize that no, that's just their fragility projecting onto me. So being able to say, yeah, my childhood wasn't picture perfect, but also not staying in that and saying, but I'm doing better now and focusing on what I can do for myself, but also for others. And I have a vision board where I put either quotes that I love or things that I'm looking forward to or want to manifest or whatever. And one of them says, be the person you needed when you were younger. And I'm constantly thinking about what can I do to use my experience to help other people, not just now, but also in the past, because yes, like the past needs to be a school, not a prison.
Yeah.
And so I no longer spend time thinking about, oh, well, if that hadn't happened or if this had happened instead. All I can do now is say, yeah, that was shit. But what am I going to do about that now?
And it's interesting, like just, yeah, you're saying about going, that argument that the past making you stronger, it's bullshit. Like you said, like no one wants to go through, no one should go through homophobia, no one should go through racism. And having an argument like that, in some respects, justifies,
Yeah,
it
it
reinforces,
validates the experience.
yeah, which actually is the, it's the experience which is the issue, not the actual lesson they're going through it. Yeah, right. It's amazing you'd be able to come through those experiences into the articulate guy I see before me and hear before me, right? But that doesn't justify the behavior that was pushed on you
Yeah,
through no fault of your own.
exactly. And it's like, yes, reframing losses as lessons is great, but it doesn't mean that it minimizes the impact of the loss or the bad experience, right? Like we need to be able to acknowledge that experiences can be bad, although we can learn from them. So I don't, when I talk or, engage with self-help material or mental health material, there are some things that I struggle with accepting as valid. I think there's two things that come to mind. One is this idea that, we just need to think about positively about everything and our life will be better, right? Like we can't overcorrect for all the negative experiences in our life by just staying positive all the time, because then we're not actually like accepting the problems that we faced. And it's okay to do that. I think it's just about not staying in them. So yeah, on the one hand, it's like we need to start saying that it's okay that we experience negative things, but that we're going to move forward with them and not be trapped by them. And I think the other thing that I struggle with is this idea that, well, you can change your life, you have the power within, and it's all in your perception and all in your action, because it takes me back to this conversation around identity. And most often the people who are saying that like anything's possible if you just think it kind of mentality is often people coming from a place of privilege. Often it's white men or women who are saying like, oh yeah, you just have to make the decisions in your life and you'll be fine. And it's like,
because I'm 20 miles ahead anyway.
Yeah, and it's like, there are so many barriers for me already as a gay Black man. And it's like, now you want to add on this like commentary or this language around like, well, if you just decide you want to do it, it will happen. It's like, no, there are like institutionalized things that like prevent me from having the same opportunities. And so when I talk about mental health, when I talk about anti-racism, I'm just constantly trying to get people to understand that everything is linked. Everything is woven together and it's all intersectional. I mean, you can't, in the work I do with businesses, you can't have a great place to work just based off of the perks and the benefits you offer, right? Like you have to have an environment where people feel they can bring their full selves to work. That means mental health, but that also means an identity. So like last weekend was World Mental Health Day, and I was on an IG Live talking around anti-racism and mental health. And I made a post that was talking about the very thing I'm talking about now, which is this is all connected. Right? This is this. I can't just separate, oh, my experience as a Black person and as a gay person and as someone who, suffers from mental health challenges. I can't separate all of that. It's all together. And so we have to start building a world as big as that goal seems. We have to start building a world, and it starts with our own network where people know that they can come to us in a state of vulnerability. People know that then they won't be judged for it. And we have to start having more of these conversations just so that people realize that they're not alone in something, because that for me is constantly the thing I still struggle with the most. I mean, we've talked about a lot, and we talked about my mental health journey, and there are a lot of positives to glean from it. But I think one of the experiences I had most recently during quarantine, which somehow I'm managing to get through, it's probably some of the meds that I'm taking, which is another conversation. Like for me, early on, there's this stigma around mental health, but then even beyond that, like taking medication to then support that mental health. But that's not the conversation we have with physical health. Like if there's something wrong, you're quick to take a pill for it, or you have diabetes or something else, you're quick to take medicine. But when it comes to mental health, oftentimes the narrative is, oh, just talk through it.
Mm.
And sometimes that's not enough, because sometimes brains are just chemically imbalanced and they need some support. And so I'm very open about the fact that I'm finally getting the professional help that I needed all along, which was in part therapy, but also in part medication, and being able to help my brain reset some of that chemical imbalance that has impacted me in everything from, you know, the amount of time I was taking to complete tests in school, or how much of my work was being impacted by my anxiety. And so, you know, for me, it's just constantly thinking through this lens of, yes, we need to create spaces for people to be more vulnerable. And we need to create spaces where people don't feel shame and guilt having conversations around mental health, around just what they're doing and existing in their everyday lives. And so for me, at the beginning of this this quarantine, you know, things were fine. I was doing a lot of virtual and, you know, virtually social events. You know, the one pro about being someone who's a germaphobe, actually have germophobia because of my anxiety and OCD, is that I was already prepared for this coronavirus. Like, there was nothing that was new for me. Like, people were like, oh my God, you need to get all these cool keychains to open doors, and you need to do all this gloving and all this stuff. And I was like, bruh, like, I have already not touched my face for decades because I'm afraid of germs. Like, this is nothing new for me. I was shopping without gloves because I knew I wasn't touching my face. I've always been opening doors with my elbows and pushing elevator buttons with my elbows. So like, I was ready for this. But there was a point where I had a rift with one of my best friends, and I was feeling really lonely. And it was a reminder of the fact that mental health is a journey. It's one of the affirmations I have on my mirror is, I'm not alone, because that is the deepest feeling to this day that I ever feel. I'm 27 years old, and whenever I start to feel lonely, I get to a place where if I get trapped in it, it is really hard to get out of. And on the plus side of that, at the end of this quarantine, when I was starting, after this rift, I started to feel it, I was aware of it. And I was really proud of myself because I haven't been that aware of that before. And so that for me was like, okay, you've grown. I mean, when you think about who you were in the past and who you are now, you wouldn't even have been aware of these feelings now. And then I was able to be proactive about it. I actually organized an event because I know that, you know, with my depression, it makes me not want to be social, but that's almost the exact thing I should do, is get out.
Yeah.
And so I was proactive and I said, okay, let's organize something. And I was able to like snap out of it much quicker than I've ever been able to. And it's not to say like, oh, well, that's your quick fix, right? You know, it's all easy from here. But I still can feel the weight of that young kid who is experiencing all of these challenges with his identity and mental health anytime I feel alone. Because that was something that bullies said to me, you have no friends. And it was true. And, you know, it caused relationship issues with my older sister because like I always wanted to be friends with her friends. And she was always like, you know, oh, this is this annoying kid who wants to, you know, hang out with us. I mean, we're fine now, but, you know, you have no friends, you're annoying. That was something someone said to me on a daily basis, right? And even to this day, if someone says that, I have to immediately process that and filter it and realize they're not trying to hurt me. They have no idea about my past. They're not even saying it in the same context. Like, that is a lot of work that my brain is doing just to have a conversation with somebody. And there was something I saw on Instagram the other day that was so great around signs of anxiety. And one of them was talking about like blankly staring off or something into the distant. And I often find myself when I'm having conversations with people that I'm closest with, especially my best friend, I will sometimes tell him, can you give me a second? Like, I'm actually processing something right now and I'm not giving you my full attention. That's not something I would ever have been able to do years ago. And that's that level of self-awareness that I'm just coming into and I'm still developing. But it's like that feeling of loneliness that I can sometimes get, as deep as that may be, it's like, what can I do to prevent me from getting there? Or once I realize it, what can I do moving forward? But don't at all take anything I've said, and I don't think you would or anyone would have, as everything's fine now. Because like I said, there are still emotional triggers that I still deal with every day. And this one happened like a month ago where I was feeling really low, and it's a scary space because you start to remember your past and some of that stuff starts to come up. And so I just think I'm so fortunate to be able to be vulnerable with people in my life. And part of that was just me from the outset saying, like, basically setting the standard, not consciously, but like through conversation and engagement from the early onset of any relationship or friendship that I have. Like, I'm very open and vulnerable from the beginning. And I think just setting that bar, it not only encourages other people to get there with you, but it also makes the relationship more fulfilling for me and for other people, because I can, without any fear of judgment, say to my friends, hey, can you give me a minute? I'm actually processing something you just said, or processing something I just saw, and I can't focus right now, and I just need a minute.
And so, final question.
Sure.
Taking where you are now in terms of how you cope in those difficult situations, like, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
Yeah. Oh, great question. I'm not going to give you the Matthew McConaughey answer, because that would get a little confusing for all of us. But I think to my 12-year-old self, I mean, that's a tough one. So many things are coming through my head right now around, like, oh, it gets better. It's such a cliche. But then on one hand, that almost just like placates the experience. So I think for me, what I would tell myself is, you've got this. Like, you can do this. I needed that. I mean, going back to our conversation around bravery, I didn't have self-esteem when I was growing up. I didn't feel comfortable in my own skin for a lot of reasons, pun intended. And so I think just being able to tell myself, like, you will get through this, you will survive this, would have been so helpful. And there were some elements of that narrative. I remember my mom, and now that I think about it, you know, credit to her, because, you know, sometimes you don't always understand how to have these conversations with your kids, but she got me a book and went to a book signing and waited in line to get a signature on this book. And it was called The Geeks Will Inherit the Earth.
Yeah.
And that was the kind of narrative that I needed as a younger kid. Like, high school bullshit.
Yeah.
Like, yes, everyone has a tough time. Well, not everyone. There are some popular kids that have a great time, but high school is bullshit. And it is not a sign of your value or your worth. And you just need to get into the real world, quote unquote, or get around people who are more developed, and to be able to realize who you are. But why can't it be that we just need to make high school and middle school that environment where people can be their full self? So yeah, the advice I would give myself is you can do this, and you will get through it. And I think about now, sometimes that's what I tell myself now, is like, even with these affirmations, you are mentally resilient. That is me telling myself that, like, I can get through this. And after my morning affirmations, this is the last thing I say. I say, today is yours, so back yourself and make it count. And so it's something that I would tell my 12-year-old self, and it's something I still tell myself now, is today is yours, back yourself.
And also, and to really, if we're going to early intervention, we can give people the tools, we can give people the resources, but reality is, if you can give someone or support them into developing their own full self-esteem and sense of self and confidence, that at the time can be enough to guide them on their own way to go through whatever their journey they're going to go through, but with a sense of, I've got this.
And that's exactly the same mentality I take in my anti-racist work and the Anti-Racist Social Club. Is I'm creating spaces and resources for people to then come into a space where they can learn. Because anti-racism, just like mental health, is something you have to do the work with, right? And a lot of the work is internally as well. And so it's all about creating spaces for people to come to vulnerably and say, either I fucked up, or I don't know what to do, or I want to be an ally, I don't know how, and to be able to create resources for them in that learning. So that's exactly the mentality I have in everything that I do, and why the work I do is the work that I love. And so I was very thankful to be able to be here and talk about my journey. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for a fascinating, insightful conversation. I mean, to be able to have a conversation on so many dimensions as well, and to hear your story growing, going from school, a very difficult time at school, through to challenge day, where in some respects that, that catalyzer, always a pillar in the ground of saying, I've got this. or I'm starting to get this, moving on to university, and then now where you are today, like, you know, talking to corporates, running the anti-racist social club. Like, I mean, as I've said, I've listened to all your videos, and I would encourage all listeners to go onto the website, which is, you tell me?
Yeah, so it's www.theantiracist.social.club, and we've got over 500 resources for learning, podcasts, movies, a great filter feature where we've tagged every single item based off the topic, what age it's appropriate for. And by we, I mean, I had to go through and manually do all of that. And that is a testament to, when we're talking about mental health, I mean, talking about anti-racism as a Black person is not always easy. I mean, I posted one of those videos that you saw on YouTube, and before I removed the comment section, I thought, oh, let me create safe spaces and allow anyone to comment. The internet trolls got to it within 45 seconds, and they commented and spelled out the N-word in the comments. And so I love the work that I do, but it's constantly reminding me that mental health is so important. So check in on your marginalized friends or your friends in marginalized communities, especially now. I mean, we've gone through a lot this year. And so just check in on them, and there's always something you can do. So check out our website, follow us on Instagram. I'm sure he'll post all the links with this. So yeah, we're happy to have you in the club, and thanks so much for having me in this conversation.
Awesome. Honestly, thank you so much for having us. We really appreciate it.
Cheers. Have a good day.
And thank you to everyone listening. You can subscribe to us on most major podcast platforms, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Just search for Sidekick Community or Sidekick Stories and we'll pop up. Thanks so much again, Hakeem.